So I started working in an international NGO called Consumers International, and that was based in 120 countries, and I did trade policy there, and I had to make trade policy for these consumer bodies. And I realized not only was I more interested in the international than the domestic, but there was very little that skills-wise, that I could say about international law that was relevant to consumer protection, and I was working also on trade and competition. So I took myself off to study international law in Amsterdam, and that was when I started, and then I went from there to do my PhD. Because I am interested in cross-border issues, and international law really is the place to address cross-border problems. My research area is international trade law, and I particularly specialise on competition, antitrust and public procurement. But I'm very interested in WTO law and regional trade agreements. So what I'm talking about this evening is about regional trade agreements and WTO and as they affect gender and how gender has been brought into the discussion. When I first started in trade was gender neutral, and we accepted it was gender neutral, and now people realise that actually it's not gender neutral, it has different impacts on men and women, and we need to know about the implications of that on men and women. But when I started gender neutral, what you wanted was trade. You wanted trade to make the pie bigger so that governments could redistribute it however they wanted. That was the sole objective, was just to make growth. Now we're talking about actually being a bit more nuanced about that growth and making sure that if there are losers, those losers are looked after within policy. So things have changed a lot. And when I started, really we just thought that the solution to most problems was growth. Well, I think the most significant problem is really the fragmentation of international law. And on the one hand, we have a lot of voices calling for more international law, but we can also see that sovereignty is a very big issue when it comes to international law. And there's been an upswing in protectionism and sovereignty and sovereign decision-making calls for that. We can see that in the US, we can see that in China, we can see that in Britain with Brexit. So I think while on the one hand there is this dynamic which is globalizing, where we need more international law because there's more and more cross-border activity, on the other hand, a lot of people are very scared that international law is about big government far away from them, making decisions about their lives, and they have no contact with this. So the challenge is to make people feel that they're actually part of international law, and in some way their voice is heard, even though it's an international level. There must be some mechanism where people feel that they actually are a part of the decision-making process and a part of the dispute settlement-making process. Otherwise, I think we will have more people calling against international dynamics and international law, or questioning the legitimacy of those decisions. Well, there are two women that I am particularly sort of proud of as women, but also I'm impressed with and I respect very much. One of them is Rosalind Higgins, who was the president of the International Court of Justice, the first. She was one of the first female judges on the ICJ, and she's not just a lawyer and a barrister, but she's a first-class academic. So she went back and forth. She worked for the UN, and she did a lot of studying and research at LSE. So at the end of her career, she's got a stack of extremely important academic books that she's contributed to international law, peacekeeping, human rights. But on the other hand, she's been in charge of some very important cases. And I think that, you know, when I look at her profile, I just think what an admirable woman she is, that she's managed to traverse practice and academia and also develop international law in The Hague to become much more professionalised and modernised. Because she started off very, you know, when it was very much in its infancy after the sort of Second World War and the Cold War. So Rosalind Higgins is one of the best ones for me, and the other one in my field of competition is a woman called Eleanor Fox, and she's still lecturing in New York, and she started in the 60s, and at that point I think Harvard Law School didn't even admit women until the mid-50s, so she really came out at a time when it was extremely male-dominated profession. Antitrust was very male-dominated, and she somehow has managed to make it. And again, she's made it in academia as well as in practice. And she's still, although most people would retire, she's still contributing a lot to, particularly to developing countries and antitrust and competition law. And she's fought, as Rosalind has, against the kind of embedded sort of male dominance in our field, and she sort of turned it, and she's an inspiration for people like me, because as soon as you know somebody's broken the ceiling, then the ceiling's broken, you can go too. As a woman, sometimes it's perhaps it's something we make for ourselves, inside ourselves, but there's an insecurity that we're not good enough, and that we have to be twice as good as men to achieve the same as men. And I think that puts an awful lot of pressure on us in terms of sort of a work-life balance. And I think a lot of women feel that if they're going to be in the same workplace as men, they have to sacrifice other things in their life so that they can achieve as males do. I've certainly felt that. When I first started in international trade law, I think sometimes I was the only woman there, and I always felt that either it was tokenism, or I was there for an ornamental reason, or I was there because in the social activity afterwards they wanted to have a couple of women. I was never really secure that I was there for the right reasons, and I always thought I was there maybe for the wrong reasons. But I think if you stick it out and you're professional and you don't change your objective and you don't change your desires, then you will break through. It just takes it's a lot harder than for men, I believe. Well, I've been really lucky. I got involved with the World Trade Organization work when I was about in my 30s, and that's been some of the most rewarding and enriching work I've done. I've gone to all over the world with the WTO technical assistance in developing countries, and I've met so many interesting people, and I've seen perspectives on trade and development that I never would have done if I'd have just stayed in one country. And the World Trade Organization has a very special role. At the same time, people are very suspicious of it in some quarters, so you always have to feel that you know what you're defending and what you're not defending. But this gave me the opportunity really to travel around and to access government officials who talked about how government works and how trade works in their government that I never would have done if I'd have just been an academic. I think one of the things I think we lack are other women mentors. I think most people in their career, they need a mentor to advise them or to shape their path or to help them in some way. And I think because there aren't that many women in my profession, you often have male mentors. And again, the same problems arise. You don't know if they're mentoring you for the right reason, or whether it's something to do with who you are or what they want, rather than the fact that they're a mentor. And I have had female mentors, and I found it incredibly encouraging that women help each other, because you sometimes get the impression that the competition is great amongst women as well. So you never know if women are your competitors or your comrades. But when you have a female mentor, you realise that there are women out there who want to support other women for the right reason, and they actually believe in women, and they also want to change the discourse. They want to change the narrative, and you can't do that unless women are there. Men can't talk about women's issues in the same way that women can talk about women's issues. And in trade that's really important, because we have a lot of disparity of in labour markets, for example, that's caused by international trade. And you can't fully take into account the gender perspective unless you have women there. It's just how it is. It's the same with every marginalised group. If they're not at the discussion table, if they're not in the decision-making rooms, their perspective is really not taken on board properly. Maybe it's taken on superficially, but it's not embedded in the discussion. It's a really difficult one. I work in a field of trade where there are lots of preferences and lots of discrimination for certain things, small businesses, women, disabled people. And I think that if there is an impact assessment, if people have actually done the work and they've worked out what the objective of the measure is, and then they look at it, the ex-ante objective, and then they monitor it and they find out what's going on, then there could be a very good argument for that. And for example, giving women safe seats in politics as a way to get them into sort of become politicians and members of parliament. What I fear, though, is that it might create a kind of backlash, and maybe it's not actually doing what we want it to do. Maybe the support should be in scholarships and in earlier on in the educational system rather than in the jobs, because you will find that there's always going to be people who say you got the job for the wrong reason, and you want people to get the job for the right reason, and that could be because they need more scholarships and they need different kind of help in education. If they have families at home, they need other kind of supports. So maybe for me it goes a bit wider than having a quota. But if I saw some evidence that suggested that having a quota was a really good idea, then I would be behind it. But there isn't enough evidence on what happens to people in those quotas. In America, they have a lot of quotas at the state level, but they don't do impact assessments. They don't say what happens. And I think sometimes, for example, if you have quotas for sort of minorities, then in America, if they've had quotas for minorities for so long, why is it still more likely for a black man to go to prison than to university? What have the quotas been doing? What has the positive discrimination been doing? You don't want it just to be the measure itself. Actually, you want to change society fundamentally. So we don't want window dressing. We don't want something that just says, well, we're doing something for people. We want actually to do something for people. And that's where we need to have targeted measures, and we need to have evidence, and we need to follow up what happens. And we need to see, actually, if this is a very good way of getting people into the workplace, or whether it should happen earlier. It should happen with mothers and childcare and scholarships and after-school clubs and other measures. There are lots of measures that can support women. But we need the evidence before we choose them. Well, there are a lot more women in international law than 20, 30 years ago when I started. And actually they're coming out of the sort of softer areas and coming right into sort of the hard sort of core subjects of international law, like criminal law and trade law and so on. I think a lot of the challenges are this sort of work-life balance. I think if you want to have a family, then you need other supports. You need to have childcare. You need to have flexible working hours. You need to be able to know that your boss is not going to penalise you if you phone up and say, my child is ill, or I've got some care work to do. I mean, women are predominantly the carers. So even if it's not children, it's going to be parents or grandparents or ill people in the family. So it's really about changing the idea that it's okay to not have to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, which I think a lot of people feel they have to do to be successful these days because life is much more competitive. There are fewer jobs. Technology has taken over a lot of law jobs as well. Artificial intelligence is going to change our jobs and the way our jobs are done. And I think that's put a lot of pressure on us to be more competitive and to feel that we have to strive. And again, we only have 24 hours a day, so the chances are the extra hours are going to come from the work, not from the work side, but they're coming from the family life side, which is a stress, I think, an extra stress. And so I think it's really about understanding that people who have other obligations are the normal people. And that should be mainstream. The fact that it's normal to have children, and it's normal to phone in sick because your child is ill, and it's normal to have to rush out because something's happened at school. At the moment, I think people feel they have to hide that, and they have to always pretend that that's not going on. Whereas actually that is life, and that is normal. So we need that work-life balance.